The snow had begun to fall gently over Evergreen Hollow, a picturesque town nestled in the hills of Vermont. The kind of place where Christmas wasn't just a date on the calendar but a season that stretched through December, filled with bustling markets, glowing lights, and carolers serenading down cobblestone streets. Evergreen Hollow had charm to spare, and its traditions were legendary. But for Clara Winslow, the magic of Christmas had always seemed just out of reach. Clara sat quietly at the edge of the grand family dinner table, her fork idly pushing a green bean across her plate. Around her, the air hummed with laughter and animated conversations. The Winslows were known for their opulence, and their holiday dinners were nothing short of theatrical. Crystal chandeliers glinted against polished mahogany, and the scent of roasted turkey mingled with the faint trace of Harrison Winslow's expensive cologne. Her father sat at the head of the table, a commanding figure in a tailored suit, his booming voice dominating the room as he regaled the guests with stories of business triumphs. Clara had heard them all before. Her father's empire spanned industries, and his name carried weight in every corner of the country. But while his stories entertained the room, they always left her feeling invisible. She was the only daughter in a family that prized perfection above all else, and Clara had learned early on that she was not the kind of perfection her father wanted. "Clara," Harrison's voice cut through her thoughts. She looked up quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I don't think our guests have heard about your latest projects." His words were laced with a pointed edge, his smile tight. The guests turned their attention toward her, their curiosity lukewarm at best. "I've been volunteering at Esperanza Para Magna," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. "It's a home for children who need—" "Oh, Clara's always had a charitable heart," Harrison interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Not the most profitable endeavor, but admirable, I suppose." The room tittered politely, and Clara's stomach sank. Her father's ability to diminish her achievements in a single sentence was almost impressive. She glanced at her mother, who sat poised beside Harrison, her expression a perfect blend of neutrality and discomfort. Clara knew better than to expect her support. After dinner, Clara slipped out onto the veranda, grateful for the crisp night air. The snowflakes danced under the glow of the outdoor lanterns, and for a moment, the beauty of the scene softened her thoughts. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, wishing she could escape the weight of expectations that came with the Winslow name. "Escaping the chaos," a voice said behind her. Clara turned to see Thomas Miller leaning casually against the railing. He was one of the few people she genuinely looked forward to seeing during these events. As her father's driver, Thomas often found himself at the edges of the Winslow world, a silent observer of its extravagance. "Something like that," Clara replied, offering a small smile. "What about you? Taking a break from chauffeuring?" Thomas chuckled. "Your father insists I stick around until the last guest leaves, but I figured I'd check on you first." Clara appreciated his thoughtfulness more than she could say. Unlike everyone else in her orbit, Thomas never seemed to expect anything from her. He simply listened. Over the past year, as their paths crossed more frequently, she'd come to cherish their quiet conversations. "You look like you needed rescuing back there," Thomas said, his tone light but his gaze warm. "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice betrayed her weariness. "It's just the usual. I don't think I'll ever be what they want me to be." Thomas's brow furrowed. "And why would you want to be? From where I stand, you're already doing something that matters. That place, Esperanza Para Magna. Those kids need someone like you." His words settled over her like a blanket of warmth. Clara looked up at him, her smile growing more genuine. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot." Hearing that, they stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow accumulate on the pristine lawn below. The faint sound of carolers drifted through the air, their voices harmonizing in a song that felt like a balm to her weary soul. "Clara," Thomas said after a while, his voice quieter now, "have you ever thought about leaving all this behind? Starting fresh somewhere else?" She laughed, though there was a wistfulness in the sound. "I've thought about it, but it's not that simple. This is my family, for better or worse." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who stands by you when it matters." His words lingered in her mind long after they'd returned to the warmth of the house. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, Clara found herself staring out the window of her bedroom, watching the snow blanket Evergreen Hollow in quiet stillness. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like if she chose her own path. A life where her worth wasn't measured by anyone else's standards. And for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. The days following the Winslow family dinner passed in a blur of activity for Clara. The holiday season in Evergreen Hollow was always busy, but this year, she threw herself into her work at the shelter more than ever. The warmth and laughter of the children at Esperanza Para Amania filled a void that her father's lavish but hollow celebrations could never touch. There was something grounding about the shelter, something real that reminded her of what mattered. It was here that she felt truly seen, not as Harrison Winslow's daughter, but as someone who made a difference. On one particularly cold afternoon, Clara arrived at the shelter with her arms full of donated coats and scarves. The scent of cinnamon and pine greeted her as she stepped inside, mingling with the faint sound of a child's giggle from the back room. She smiled, shaking the snow from her boots as she was met by Sarah, the shelter's director. "You're a sight for sore eyes," Sarah said, her face lighting up. "Those coats will make a world of difference." The cold's biting hard this year. Clara set the bundles on the counter and began sorting through them. "I can't stay late to help distribute them," she offered. "Are we still expecting more kids to come by today?" Sarah nodded, her expression growing serious. "A few more, yes. One of them is new, a little boy, Jack. He just arrived last night." The name caught Clara's attention. "Jack?" she repeated, pausing. "What's his story?" Sarah sighed. "He's been through a lot. Lost his mother recently, no father in the picture that we know of. He's quiet, but you can tell he's carrying a lot of weight for someone so young." Clara felt a pang in her chest. Over the past year, she'd encountered more stories like Jack's than she could count. Each one broke her heart in its own way. She resolved to meet him before the day was over, determined to make him feel welcome. Later that afternoon, as Clara finished hanging the last of the coats on a rack, she spotted a small figure sitting by the window. He was bundled in a sweater several sizes too big, his knees drawn up to his chest as he stared out at the snow. She approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hi there," she said gently. "You must be Jack." The boy turned his head, his wide brown eyes meeting hers. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. "I'm Clara," she continued, crouching to meet him at eye level. "I help out here sometimes." "It's nice to meet you." Jack hesitated before murmuring, "Hi." She smiled. "Do you like the snow? It looks like we might get a lot this year." Jack nodded, his small hands clutching the edge of the oversized sweater. "It's pretty," he said softly. Clara took a seat beside him, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel crowded. "It is," she agreed. "But it's even better when you have warm clothes to enjoy it in. Did you see the coats we just brought in? I bet we can find one that fits you perfectly." Jack shrugged, his gaze drifting back to the window. "I don't need anything." His words struck Clara as both surprising and sad. Most of the children at the shelter were eager for something new. A coat, a toy, anything to call their own. Jack, though, seemed detached, as if he'd already learned not to expect much. "Well," she said after a moment, "if you change your mind, let me know. I'd be happy to help." She spent the rest of the afternoon keeping an eye on him, occasionally offering small gestures of kindness. A cup of hot cocoa, a warm blanket. He didn't say much, but by the time she left the shelter that evening, she thought she saw a hint of a smile when she waved goodbye. That night, as she sat by the fire in her family's sprawling mansion, Clara's thoughts kept returning to Jack. There was something about him that she couldn't shake, something that felt strangely familiar. She decided to bring it up with Thomas the next day when he picked her up for her usual visit to the shelter. Thomas listened quietly as Clara recounted her encounter with Jack. "He sounds like a tough kid," he said. "Kids like that, they've been through more than anyone should at that age." Clara nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. "I want to do more for him. He's so reserved, like he doesn't trust anyone. It's heartbreaking." Thomas glanced at her as he turned the car onto the snowy road leading to the shelter. You're already doing more than most people would, Clara. Just showing up, being there for him. That matters." His words comforted her, but they didn't quell the feeling that there was more to Jack's story than anyone realized. When they arrived at the shelter, Clara was greeted by Sarah, whose expression was unusually tense. "Clara, we need to talk," Sarah said, pulling her aside. "It's about Jack." "What is it?" Clara asked, her heart tightening. Sarah hesitated before handing Clara a worn envelope. It was addressed in neat handwriting, and when Clara saw the name on the front, her breath caught in her throat. "Harrison Winslow," she read aloud, disbelief coloring her voice. Sarah nodded. "Jack had it with him when he arrived. He says it's from his mom. I haven't opened it. Thought you should see it first." Clara stared at the envelope, her mind racing. Why would a boy like Jack have a letter addressed to her father? The realization hit her like a thunderclap. There was only one explanation, and it was one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. As her eyes scanned the words, her world shifted. Everything she thought she knew about her father, about her family, was suddenly thrown into question. Jack wasn't just another child in need. He was part of her family. Clara stared at the letter, the words blurring as her mind tried to catch up with what she had just read. The handwriting was soft and deliberate, filled with emotion that practically bled through the paper. Jack's mother, Amelia, had written to Harrison Winslow in her final days. The letter was brief, but its message was clear. Jack was his son. Clara's breath hitched as the truth sunk in, its weight pressing down on her chest like a stone. She turned to Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did Jack say anything about this? About how he got the letter?" Sarah shook her head, her expression a mixture of sympathy and unease. "Not much. Just that his mom gave it to him before she passed. She told him to bring it here, to your father." Clara's mind raced. Why had Amelia trusted Harrison to care for Jack? Her father was many things, calculating, proud, and deeply protective of his reputation. But compassion had never been his strong suit. She couldn't imagine him stepping into the role of a father to a boy like Jack. Her heart ached at the thought of how alone and confused the boy must feel. "Does my father know?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "I don't think so," Sarah replied. "Jack hasn't mentioned meeting him, and the letter doesn't seem like it's been read." Clara folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Her hands trembled as she held it, knowing this piece of paper could shatter the fragile facade of her family. But as much as she dreaded the confrontation, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Jack deserved answers. He deserved to know where he came from and why he'd been left to fend for himself. Clara found Jack sitting in his usual spot by the window, his small frame bathed in the soft afternoon light. He glanced up as she approached, his expression wary but curious. "Hey, Jack," she said, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "Can we talk for a minute? It's about your mom." Jack's face tightened, and he looked away, his fingers curling into the fabric of his sweater. "What about her?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She left you something very important. A letter. It explains a little about why she sent you here." Jack's eyes darted back to her, his brow furrowing. "Did you read it?" "I did," she admitted. "It was addressed to someone I know. My father." The boy's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, he simply stared at her. "Your dad?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Clara nodded. She wanted him to know about you, about how special you are. Jack frowned, the emotions flickering across his face too complex for someone so young. If I'm special, why didn't he come for me? Why didn't she tell him sooner? Clara's heart clenched at the question. She didn't have the answers Jack needed, but she knew they couldn't stay buried forever. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I want to help you find out. Would that be okay?" Jack stared at her for a long moment, his small shoulders tense as if bracing for rejection. Finally, he gave a hesitant nod. "Okay." Later that evening, Clara returned to her family's estate, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. The house was quiet, its grand halls filled only with the muffled sounds of staff preparing for another holiday event. She found her father in his study, seated behind a massive desk adorned with framed photos and business awards. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. "Clara," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what brings you here so late? I thought you'd be at that shelter of yours." Clara stepped forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I was. And I found something there that I think you need to see." Harrison arched a brow, but his easy confidence faltered when Clara placed the envelope on the desk in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Read it," she said simply. Harrison hesitated before picking up the envelope. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the page with a growing look of disbelief. When he finally set it down, his face was pale, his jaw tight. For a long moment, he said nothing, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Since today," Clara replied. "Jack brought it with him. He thought you'd want to know." Harrison let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "This is absurd. I didn't even know Amelia had a child, let alone that he was mine." "But he is," Clara said firmly. "And he's here, right now. He's just a boy, Dad. A boy who's lost his mother and has no one else." Harrison's expression darkened, his defenses rising. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my reputation? To the family's name?" Clara's temper flared. "Your reputation? That's what you're worried about. Not the fact that your son is living in a shelter, wondering why his father doesn't want him." Her words cut through the room like a knife, and for the first time, Harrison looked genuinely shaken. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. I didn't know." "Well, now you do," Clara said, her voice softer now. "And you have a choice to make. Jack doesn't care about your reputation. He just wants to know where he belongs." Harrison didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the letter as if it held all the answers he needed. Clara watched him carefully, her anger giving way to a faint glimmer of hope. For all his faults, she knew her father wasn't a heartless man. Maybe, just maybe, he would do the right thing. After what felt like an eternity, Harrison finally spoke. "Bring him here. Tomorrow." Clara's heart skipped at his words. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. She left the study that night feeling a mix of apprehension and relief. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. Jack deserved a chance at belonging, and she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter with a sense of nervous anticipation. The snow outside had piled high during the night, blanketing the town in a soft white glow. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of pancakes being served to the children. Jack was sitting at a corner table, eating quietly, his small frame hunched slightly over his plate. Clara's heart ached at how solitary he seemed, even in a room full of laughter. She approached him cautiously, offering a warm smile. "Good morning, Jack. Did you sleep okay?" Jack glanced up at her, nodding slightly. "Yeah, it was fine." Clara sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I talked to my father last night. I told him about you." Jack's fork paused midair, and he set it down slowly. "What did he say?" Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He wants to meet you. Today." Jack's eyes widened, and for a moment, Clara couldn't tell if he was excited or scared. "He does?" he asked, his voice small. "Yes," she replied gently. "I'll be with you the whole time. We'll go together. I promise, Jack, you won't have to do this alone." He stared at his plate, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "What if he doesn't like me?" Clara's chest tightened. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. "That's not going to happen. You're an amazing kid, Jack. If he can't see that, then that's his loss, not yours." Jack nodded slowly, though he still looked uncertain. Clara gave him time, letting the moment settle. After a while, he seemed to gather his courage, looking up at her with determination. "Okay," he said. "I'll go." By mid-morning, Clara had bundled Jack into her car, his small figure swallowed by a puffy coat they'd found for him at the shelter. The drive to the Winslow estate was quiet, Jack's nervous energy filling the car like static electricity. Clara tried to keep the conversation light, pointing out the snow-covered trees and the ice skaters gliding on the frozen lake near the town square, but Jack's responses were short, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When they arrived at the estate, Clara parked near the grand entrance and turned to Jack. "Are you ready?" she asked. He looked up at the towering house, his eyes wide. "It's so big. It can feel a little overwhelming," Clara admitted. "But it's just a house, Jack. What matters is the people inside." Jack nodded, his hand gripping the door handle tightly. Clara stepped out first, walking around to open his door. She offered him her hand, and after a brief hesitation, he took it. Together, they walked up the steps and into the house. Harrison was waiting in the living room, standing near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was an uncharacteristic tension in his posture. When Jack entered the room, Harrison's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "Jack," Clara said softly, kneeling beside him. "This is my father." Jack shifted awkwardly, his eyes darting between Clara and Harrison. "Hi," he said, his voice barely audible. Harrison cleared his throat, taking a step closer. "Hello, Jack," he said, his tone measured. "It's nice to meet you." The boy said nothing, his small frame stiff. Clara stood, her hand still resting on Jack's shoulder. "Why don't we all sit down?" she suggested, breaking the silence. They moved to the couch, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken emotions. Harrison sat across from them, his gaze studying Jack intently. Clara could see the conflict in her father's eyes. A man who had built his life on control, now faced with something he couldn't simply manage or dismiss. "How old are you, Jack?" Harrison asked, his voice softening slightly. 8, Jack replied, still avoiding his gaze. Harrison nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "You must be very brave, coming here like this." Jack glanced at Clara, as if seeking her reassurance. She smiled encouragingly. "He is," she said. "He's been through more than most kids his age." Harrison's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more. Instead, he shifted his focus to Clara. "This is unexpected," he said, his words carefully chosen. "I need some time to think." Clara's temper flared at his hesitation, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Time isn't something Jack has in abundance, Dad. He's here now. He needs to know where he belongs." Harrison's gaze shifted back to Jack, and something in the boy's quiet vulnerability seemed to crack his resolve. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter. "Jack, I want to get to know you. If you'll let me." Jack looked up at him for the first time, his expression cautious but curious. "You do?" "Yes," Harrison said, his tone earnest. "I didn't know about you before, and I can't change that. But now that I do, I'd like to make things right." Clara felt a flicker of hope at her father's words, though she knew this was only the beginning. "Jack," she said gently, "what do you think?" Jack hesitated, his small fingers twisting in the hem of his coat. "Can Clara stay too?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Of course," Harrison said without hesitation. "Whatever makes you comfortable." Jack nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. Clara gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze, feeling a swell of pride at his courage. For the first time since meeting him, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The next few days passed in a blur of cautious interactions and tentative steps towards something resembling a bond. Harrison, unused to the presence of a child in his meticulously ordered world, struggled to find his footing. Jack, for his part, was equally uncertain. He seemed to oscillate between curiosity and mistrust, a boy testing the waters of a connection he wasn't sure he wanted. Clara stayed close to both of them, acting as a bridge between her father's stiff demeanor and Jack's guarded silence. She spent hours helping Jack settle into the guest room they'd prepared for him, a cozy space tucked away on the second floor. It was a far cry from the dormitory-style accommodations of the shelter, but Jack seemed hesitant to claim it as his own. "Do you like it?" Clara asked as she sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jack explore the room. He nodded, running a hand along the soft quilt that covered the mattress. "It's nice. Really nice. You can decorate it however you want," she said, her voice gentle. "We can get some posters or maybe some bookshelves for your things." Jack's hand stilled, and he looked up at her. "I don't have any things." The simplicity of his statement hit Clara like a punch to the gut. She bit back the rush of emotion that threatened to rise, nodding instead. "Well, we'll fix that," she said with a smile. "You'll have whatever you need." Jack gave her a small, shy smile in return, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt. Clara knew that trust wasn't something Jack could give easily. It had to be earned. That evening, Harrison joined them for dinner, a rare occurrence in a household where meals were usually taken in solitude or among carefully curated guests. The table was smaller than the one used for grand family gatherings, but it still felt too large with just the three of them. Harrison cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "So, Jack," he began, his tone measured, "what sorts of things do you enjoy? Sports? Reading?" Jack shrugged, poking at the food on his plate. "I dunno." Clara jumped in to ease the awkwardness. "He's really good at puzzles," she said. "I saw him working on one at the shelter. He's got a knack for it." "Puzzles, huh?" Harrison said, seizing on the topic. "I used to love those as a kid. We could get one to work on together if you'd like." Jack's eyes flicked to Harrison, his expression unreadable. "Maybe." Harrison nodded, seeming content with the tentative response. Clara watched the exchange with cautious optimism. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that night, as Clara helped Jack get ready for bed, he finally spoke about what had been on his mind. "Do you think he really wants me here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara knelt beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I think he's trying," she said honestly. "It's all new for him, just like it's new for you. But I know one thing for sure. He's not going to stop trying." Jack nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes lingered. Clara kissed his forehead and tucked him in, promising herself that she'd do everything in her power to make him feel safe. The following day, Harrison surprised Clara by asking her to join him for a walk around the estate grounds. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world crisp and bright under the winter sun. As they strolled through the trees, Harrison's usual confidence seemed to waver. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted abruptly. "With Jack." "With any of this?" Clara looked at him, surprised by his candor. "You're doing fine, Dad. He's just a little boy. He doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be there." Harrison stopped walking, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered path ahead. "I keep thinking about Amelia, about why she didn't tell me. Did she think I wouldn't care? That I wouldn't help?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. Maybe she didn't know how you'd react. Maybe she was afraid you'd push them away. Her father flinched at her words, as if they'd hit closer to home than she intended. "I would have helped," he said quietly. "I would have done something. But what about now?" Clara pressed gently. "You have a chance to do something now. For Jack." Harrison nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "You're right. He deserves better. I'm not going to fail him." That afternoon, Harrison took Jack into town, a move that surprised both Clara and Jack. They visited a small toy store, where Harrison encouraged Jack to pick out a puzzle, something he could enjoy at his own pace. At first, Jack seemed overwhelmed by the attention and the choices, but Harrison patiently guided him, helping him select a set of intricate puzzles that made the boy's eyes light up. By the time they returned to the estate, Jack's excitement was evident. He showed Clara the puzzles with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, his small hands eagerly pointing out the designs. Harrison watched from the doorway, his expression softening as he saw the connection forming. Over the next few days, the mood in the house began to shift. Jack grew more comfortable in his surroundings, and Harrison, though still awkward at times, made genuine efforts to connect with him. They worked on puzzles together in the evenings, their quiet conversations punctuated by the occasional laugh. Clara often watched them from a distance, her heart swelling with pride at how far they'd come in such a short time. But beneath the progress, Clara sensed that both Harrison and Jack were still carrying burdens they hadn't yet shared. The road ahead would not be without challenges, but for the first time, She felt a glimmer of hope that they could truly become a family. As Christmas Eve approached, the house began to transform. Garland adorned the staircases, lights twinkled in every corner, and the scent of fresh pine filled the air. It was the kind of holiday magic that Clara had always dreamed of, a home filled not just with decorations but with love. She only hoped it would last. The soft hum of Christmas music played in the background as Clara helped Jack untangle a string of lights in the living room. The tree, a towering evergreen that nearly touched the vaulted ceiling, stood half-decorated with twinkling bulbs and delicate ornaments. Jack was unusually focused, carefully unraveling the knots in the wire with a determination that made Clara smile. "Almost there," she said, holding one end of the strand steady. "You're really good at this." Jack shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I like figuring things out." "Well, you're doing a great job. I think this tree is going to be the most beautiful one we've ever had." Jack's face lit up at the compliment, and for a moment, Clara could see the boy he might have been if life had been kinder to him. It was moments like these that made all the effort worth it. Harrison entered the room then, carrying a box of ornaments. He paused in the doorway, watching them with a thoughtful expression before clearing his throat. "I found a few more decorations in the attic. Thought we could add them to the tree." Jack glanced at him and then back at the lights in his hands. "Okay," he said softly. Clara smiled at her father. "Perfect timing. Jack's just about done with the lights." Harrison set the box down on the floor and knelt beside it, pulling out a delicate glass ornament shaped like a snowflake. "This one was always my favorite," he said, holding it up for Jack to see. "I used to hang it right in the center of the tree when I was your age." Jack looked at the ornament, his eyes wide with curiosity. "It's pretty," he said. "Do you want to hang it up?" Harrison asked, offering it to him. Jack hesitated for a moment before nodding. He took the ornament carefully, as if it were the most precious thing he'd ever held, and walked over to the tree. With Clara's help, he found the perfect spot near the center, where the light caught the glass and made it shimmer. "Looks like you've got an eye for this," Harrison said, his tone warm. Jack turned to him, his expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Thanks." Clara watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Each small moment of connection felt like a step closer to the family she'd always hoped they could become. The past few days had been full of such moments, and though there were still barriers to overcome, she could see both Jack and Harrison beginning to let their guards down. That evening, as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, the three of them gathered around the fireplace. Harrison had lit a fire, its warmth filling the room and casting a golden glow over the walls. Jack sat on the floor with one of his new puzzles, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked to fit the pieces together. Clara and Harrison watched from the couch, their conversation low and easy. "You're good with him," Clara said, breaking a comfortable silence. Harrison glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm trying. I don't want to make any more mistakes." Clara reached over, resting a hand on his arm. "You're not. He sees that you care. That's what matters." Harrison looked down at Jack, who was holding up a puzzle piece with a triumphant grin. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd get another chance to do something that really mattered. And now that it's here, I'm terrified of messing it up." "You won't," Clara said firmly. "You've already done more than you realize." Harrison didn't respond, but the flicker of hope in his eyes told her she'd reached him. The next day, preparations for Christmas Eve were in full swing. The house was bustling with activity as staff set the table, hung garlands, and prepared a feast fit for a king. Harrison had insisted on hosting a dinner, a tradition Clara hadn't seen him embrace in years. He even invited a small group of close friends, people who had known the Winslow family for decades. Jack seemed both excited and nervous about the evening. Clara helped him pick out an outfit, a crisp white shirt and dark pants that made him look like a miniature gentleman. As she adjusted his collar, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Do I have to talk to everyone?" he asked. Clara laughed softly. "Only if you want to. Just be yourself, Jack. That's all anyone could ever ask for." When the guests arrived, the house came alive with laughter and conversation. Jack stuck close to Clara at first, his hand clutching hers tightly as they moved through the crowd. But as the evening wore on, he began to relax, especially when he discovered a group of children his age who had come with their parents. Clara watched from a distance as Jack joined the other kids near the tree, his laughter ringing out for the first time since she'd met him. Harrison stood beside her, a glass of wine in hand, his gaze fixed on Jack. "He looks happy," Harrison said, his voice tinged with wonder. "He is," Clara replied. "And that's because of you." Harrison shook his head. "It's because of you. You're the one who brought him here. You saw something I didn't." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining. "It doesn't matter who started it. What matters is what we do now. Together." Harrison nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. He's a good kid. Better than I deserve." Before Clara could respond, the sound of small feet running toward them drew their attention. Jack appeared, his face flushed with excitement. "Clara, Mr. Winslow," he said, breathless. "We're going to play a game by the tree. Is that okay?" Harrison smiled, a rare, genuine expression that Clara hadn't seen in years. "Of course. And Jack, you can call me Harrison. Or, if you want, you can call me something else." Jack paused, his brow furrowing as he considered the words. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Okay, Dad." The single word hung in the air, its weight settling over all of them. Harrison's eyes glistened, and Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. It was a small step, but it meant everything. Jack ran back to the tree, leaving Clara and Harrison standing in the glow of the firelight. Harrison turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me. On us." Clara smiled, her own eyes misty. "That's what family does." As the evening drew to a close, Clara sat by the fire, watching Jack laugh and play with the other children. Harrison sat beside her, his posture relaxed, the weight of years of mistakes and regret finally beginning to lift. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the house felt like a home, a place filled with love, hope, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a fresh layer of white. Inside, the warmth of the season wrapped around them like a comforting embrace, and Clara knew that this Christmas would be one she would never forget. Christmas morning arrived quietly, the world outside the Winslow estate blanketed in pristine white snow. The early sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft golden hues across the richly decorated living room. Clara was the first to wake, drawn to the stillness of the house. She tiptoed downstairs, her heart full as she took in the sight of the tree, its ornaments glinting in the morning light. Beneath its boughs lay a small pile of gifts, each one carefully chosen in the days leading up to this moment. The quiet didn't last long. Jack's small footsteps pattered down the staircase, and Clara turned to see him peeking around the banister. He wore his new pajamas, one she had picked out just for him, and his face lit up when he saw her. "Good morning," Clara said softly, holding out her hand. Jack ran to her, his excitement palpable. "Is it time to open presents?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the tree. "Almost," Clara replied with a laugh. "Let's wait for Harrison. He'll want to be here too." Jack nodded, his energy barely contained. Clara couldn't help but marvel at the transformation she'd seen in him over the past week. The wary, quiet boy she'd met at the shelter was beginning to trust, to believe in the possibility of a place where he truly belonged. A few moments later, Harrison appeared, dressed casually for once, his hair slightly tousled. He looked almost out of place in the informal setting, but there was a softness in his demeanor that made him seem less imposing. Jack greeted him with a shy but enthusiastic smile, and Harrison returned it with one of his own. "Ready for the big moment?" Harrison asked as he settled into an armchair near the tree. Jack nodded eagerly, his small hands clasped tightly in front of him. Clara handed him the first gift, a brightly wrapped box with a tag that read, "To Jack, with love from Clara." Jack tore into the wrapping paper, revealing a large puzzle set featuring a colorful map of the world. His eyes widened as he examined the box. "This is so cool," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "Thank you." Clara smiled. "I thought you might like it." We can work on it together later if you want. Jack nodded vigorously before setting the puzzle aside and reaching for the next gift. This one was from Harrison. Jack hesitated for a moment before unwrapping it, revealing a sleek model airplane kit. He stared at it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the box. "Do you like it?" Harrison asked, his tone cautious. Jack nodded slowly, his voice soft. "Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks, Dad." The word "Dad" hung in the air, its significance not lost on anyone. Harrison's expression shifted, a mixture of pride and emotion crossing his face. "You're welcome," he said quietly. As the morning unfolded, the three of them fell into an easy rhythm, exchanging gifts and sharing stories. Clara watched with a full heart as Harrison and Jack began to connect in ways that felt natural, their bond slowly strengthening. By the time the last gift was opened, Jack was sprawled on the rug, surrounded by his treasures, his face glowing with happiness. Later in the day, the Winslow household welcomed a few close friends and neighbors for Christmas lunch. The dining room was filled with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the sterile, formal gatherings Clara had grown up with. Jack fit seamlessly into the festivities, his excitement infectious. He chatted animatedly with the other children, showing off his puzzle and model airplane, and Clara caught more than one guest remarking on how happy he seemed. As the afternoon wore on, Clara stepped outside for a moment, seeking a breath of fresh air. The snow-covered ground stretched out before her, the stillness broken only by the faint sound of children playing nearby. She was lost in thought when Harrison joined her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "You did well today," Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence. Harrison gave a small smile. "I could say the same to you. This wouldn't have happened without you." Clara shook her head. "It's not about me. It's about Jack. He needed this. He needed you." Harrison's expression grew somber. "I never thought I'd get another chance to do something good. I spent so many years focused on the wrong things. Money, power, appearances. I didn't realize how empty it all was until now." "It's not too late," Clara said gently. "You've already started. And Jack sees that. He sees you." Harrison looked at her, his eyes filled with something unspoken. "I want to be better," he said finally. "For him. For you. For all the things I let slip through my fingers." Clara reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You're already better, Dad. And we'll figure the rest out together." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Winslow family gathered around the fire. Jack sat between Clara and Harrison, his head resting against Clara's arm as he fought to stay awake. The warmth of the fire and the comfort of the day seemed to lull him into a peaceful haze. As Jack's eyes fluttered closed, Harrison leaned forward, his voice low. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" Clara nodded, her own voice soft. "He's more than okay. He's home." Harrison's gaze lingered on Jack for a long moment before he leaned back, his expression one of quiet determination. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "For everything." Clara smiled, her heart full. "That's what family does." As the house settled into a peaceful quiet, Clara looked around the room, taking in the scene. The crackling fire, the twinkling lights, the feeling of warmth and love. It was everything she had ever dreamed of and more. For the first time in years, the Winslow estate felt alive, not with the cold grandeur of wealth, but with the simple, profound beauty of family. And as the snow fell gently outside, Clara knew this was a Christmas they would all carry with them forever. The days following Christmas were filled with a sense of calm that Clara hadn't experienced in years. The once imposing Winslow estate felt lighter, as though the weight of unspoken regrets and missed connections had finally begun to lift. Jack seemed to thrive in the newfound warmth of his surroundings, his laughter filling the halls and his cautious smiles growing more frequent. Clara spent her mornings with Jack, helping him assemble his puzzle of the world map. It had become a small ritual, spreading the pieces out on the living room floor, working side by side as sunlight poured through the windows. Jack's sharp mind and focus impressed Clara, but it was the way he would look up at her and grin after fitting a tricky piece that filled her heart with joy. Harrison, to Clara's surprise, had also made an effort to carve out time for Jack. In the afternoons, he and Jack would sit together at the large dining table, carefully constructing the model airplane Harrison had given him. Jack's quiet confidence seemed to blossom under Harrison's patient guidance. Clara often found herself pausing in doorways to watch them, marveling at how far they had come in such a short time. But as the new year approached, Clara couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. She knew that their newfound peace was fragile, that the challenges of the outside world could easily intrude. More than once, she caught herself worrying about how Jack would adjust once the holiday season ended and life returned to its usual rhythms. One morning, as Clara and Jack worked on the puzzle, the phone in the study rang. Clara barely registered it, but Harrison's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he went to answer. A few minutes later, he returned, his expression unreadable. "Clara, can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his tone unusually formal. Clara glanced at Jack, who was engrossed in their puzzle. "Of course," she said, standing. "Jack, I'll be right back. Keep working on this piece. It's tricky." Jack nodded, barely looking up, and Clara followed Harrison into the study. The door closed behind them, and Harrison gestured for her to sit. He remained standing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, her stomach tightening. "That was a call from the social services office," Harrison said. "It seems there are legal complications regarding Jack's custody." Clara's breath caught. "Complications? What do you mean?" Harrison hesitated before continuing. "Amelia's family. They've expressed interest in taking Jack in. They've filed paperwork, and the caseworker needs to evaluate what's best for him." Clara felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her family? Why now? Where were they when Jack needed them before? Harrison sighed, his expression pained. "I don't know. Apparently, they weren't aware of his situation until recently. But the law tends to favor blood relatives in these cases." Clara stood, her emotions boiling to the surface. "This is his family. He's finally starting to feel safe here, to trust us. We can't let them take him away." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I agree, but we have to be prepared for a fight. The caseworker is coming tomorrow to assess the situation. We need to show them that this is the best place for Jack." Clara nodded, determination flaring in her chest. "We'll do whatever it takes." The rest of the day was marked by quiet tension. Clara didn't tell Jack about the situation, not wanting to alarm him, but she couldn't hide her own unease. Harrison, too, seemed preoccupied, though he tried to maintain a calm demeanor for Jack's sake. That evening, Clara sat with Jack as he got ready for bed. He seemed more talkative than usual, sharing stories about the puzzle they were working on and the progress he and Harrison had made on the airplane. Clara listened intently, her heart aching at the thought of how easily this sense of security could be taken from him. "Clara," Jack said suddenly, his voice quiet, "do you think I'll get to stay here? With you and Dad?" Clara's chest tightened. She forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "We want you to stay more than anything, Jack. And we're going to do everything we can to make that happen." Jack nodded, though his expression remained serious. "I like it here. It feels like home." Clara kissed his forehead, her voice soft. "It is home. Don't forget that." The next day dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple sweater and slacks that struck the right balance between casual and presentable. She wanted the caseworker to see her as someone who could provide stability, someone who cared deeply for Jack. Harrison was already in the study when Clara came downstairs. He looked up as she entered, his expression resolute. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Clara replied. "What time will they be here?" 10 o'clock, Harrison said. "Jack doesn't know, does he?" Clara shook her head. "I didn't want to worry him. I thought it was better to wait until we know more." Harrison nodded in agreement, though his concern was evident. "We'll handle this together," he said. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Clara opened the door to find a woman in her 40s, her expression professional but kind. She introduced herself as Ms. Langley, the caseworker assigned to Jack's situation. Clara led her into the living room, where Harrison joined them, his demeanor composed but earnest. The interview began with a series of questions about Jack's daily routine, his emotional well-being, and how he had adjusted to life with the Winslows. Clara spoke passionately about her bond with Jack, describing their shared moments and his progress since arriving. Harrison added his own observations, emphasizing the stability and opportunities they could provide. Ms. Langley listened intently, taking notes on a clipboard. Her expression was unreadable, and Clara found herself searching for any hint of what she might be thinking. When Jack came into the room, he looked slightly nervous but curious. Clara introduced him to Ms. Langley, who knelt to his level and spoke to him with gentle warmth. Jack answered her questions honestly, describing his favorite activities and how much he enjoyed living with Clara and Harrison. As the meeting progressed, Clara felt a mix of hope and anxiety. Jack's answers were heartfelt, and she could see that Ms. Langley was genuinely interested in understanding his perspective. But the thought of Amelia's family and their claim on Jack loomed over her like a shadow. When the meeting finally ended, Ms. Langley stood, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for your time," she said. "I'll be reviewing everything carefully before making a recommendation. This is a complex situation, but it's clear to me that you both care deeply for Jack." After she left, Clara and Harrison sat in the living room, the weight of the day settling over them. Jack had retreated to his room, unaware of the full implications of the visit. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her voice quiet. "We wait," Harrison replied, "and we hope." As the snow began to fall outside, Clara looked toward the stairs, where Jack's laughter echoed faintly from his room. She made a silent promise to herself and to him that no matter what lay ahead, she wouldn't give up. He was family now, and family fought for each other. The days following the caseworker's visit were a mix of tension and cautious hope. Clara tried to keep the atmosphere in the house as normal as possible for Jack's sake, but the weight of uncertainty loomed over every conversation she had with Harrison. Jack seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, spending his days happily playing with his new puzzles and chattering about the model airplane he and Harrison were finishing. Clara spent hours reflecting on the potential outcomes. She couldn't understand how Amelia's family, who had been absent when Jack needed them most, could suddenly step in and claim him. She couldn't fathom Jack being uprooted from the stability he'd started to find, from the family he was just beginning to trust. The idea left her feeling hollow and helpless. One evening, as Jack played by the fire, Harrison entered the room holding an envelope. His expression was grim, and Clara's heart sank. "It's from Ms. Langley," he said quietly. "Her preliminary recommendation." Clara stood, her hands trembling as she reached for the envelope. Harrison handed it to her, his gaze steady but tense. She opened it slowly, her breath catching as she read the letter. The words seemed to blur together, but one phrase leapt out at her. "Pending further review." "She hasn't decided," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She needs more time." Harrison let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "It's not the answer we wanted, but it's not a no." Clara nodded, though her chest still felt tight. "We have to do more," she said firmly. "We have to show her that Jack belongs here." Over the next few days, Clara and Harrison worked tirelessly to prepare for Ms. Langley's final visit. They compiled letters of support from friends and neighbors, including heartfelt notes from the shelter staff who had seen Clara's dedication firsthand. Harrison even reached out to a therapist who had met with Jack briefly to attest to the boy's progress since moving in with the Winslows. When Ms. Langley arrived again, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the scents of cinnamon and pine. Clara had helped Jack bake cookies that morning, a project that left him with flour-dusted hands and a satisfied grin. Jack greeted Ms. Langley with a bright hello and proudly offered her one of the cookies, a gesture that made Clara's heart swell. The interview focused more on Jack this time, with Ms. Langley observing him as he played and interacting with him directly. Jack, in his candid and innocent way, spoke about how much he liked living with Clara and Harrison. He described their evenings working on puzzles, the bedtime stories Clara read to him, and the time Harrison had taken him to see the town's Christmas lights. "Do you feel happy here, Jack?" Ms. Langley asked gently. Jack paused, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "It feels like home." Clara's breath caught at his words. She glanced at Harrison, whose expression was stoic but whose eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. After Ms. Langley left, the house fell into a tense silence. Jack, sensing the shift in mood, quietly excused himself to work on his puzzle in the living room. Clara and Harrison sat in the kitchen, their conversation hushed. "She's going to see it, right?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "She's going to see that this is where he belongs." Harrison rested a hand on hers. "We've done everything we can," he said. "Now it's up to her." The following morning, Clara received a call from Ms. Langley asking to meet with them in person. The pit in her stomach grew as she relayed the news to Harrison, but they both knew they couldn't delay the inevitable. When Ms. Langley arrived, her expression was professional but not unkind. She asked to speak with Clara and Harrison privately, leaving Jack in the kitchen with a staff member who had been helping around the house. Once seated in the study, Ms. Langley folded her hands and took a deep breath. "I want to start by saying how impressed I've been with the efforts you've made for Jack," she began. "It's clear to me that you both care deeply for him and that he's made significant progress since coming into your care." Clara's heart thudded in her chest, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "That being said," Ms. Langley continued, "this situation is complicated. Amelia's family has legitimate claims, and they've expressed a strong desire to be involved in Jack's life." Harrison's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. After much consideration, Ms. Langley said, her tone softening, "I've decided to recommend that Jack remain here with you. It's clear to me that this is where he feels safe, where he's beginning to thrive. Amelia's family will have opportunities to be involved, but I believe Jack's best interests lie in the stability you've provided." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Harrison nodded, his composure steady but his relief evident. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Ms. Langley offered a small smile. "Jack is a special boy. He deserves a home where he feels loved and secure. I believe he's found that here." After Ms. Langley left, Clara found Jack sitting in the living room, his puzzle half finished in front of him. She knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "Jack," she said softly, "we just talked to Ms. Langley. She thinks this is where you should stay. You're not going anywhere." Jack pulled back, his brow furrowing. "I get to stay? For real?" "For real," Clara said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is your home now. Always." Jack's face broke into a wide smile, and he threw his arms around her. Harrison joined them, resting a hand on Jack's shoulder, his own expression a mix of pride and emotion. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, the Winslow household was filled with an overwhelming sense of peace. Clara watched Jack sleep, his small frame curled under a blanket, his face serene. She couldn't stop the tears that fell, tears of relief, of gratitude, and of joy. For the first time, she felt certain that they had truly become a family. The weeks that followed solidified the new rhythm of their lives. Jack seemed lighter, freer, as though the uncertainty that had weighed him down had finally lifted. He laughed more often, spoke with a confidence that Clara hadn't seen before, and approached each day with an energy that warmed her heart. It was as if, for the first time, he allowed himself to fully believe in the idea of family. Harrison, too, had changed. The once distant man who prioritized his reputation over relationships now spent his evenings helping Jack with homework, offering guidance on how to finish the airplane model, or simply sitting with him in companionable silence. Clara watched with quiet pride as her father grew into his new role, the sharp edges of his personality softening with every small moment of connection he shared with Jack. One cold evening in late January, Clara stood by the window in the living room, watching as Jack and Harrison worked together to shovel the driveway. Jack, bundled in a too-big coat and a brightly knit scarf, wielded his small shovel with determination. Harrison matched his pace, his larger shovel clearing a path beside Jack's with care. They laughed together as a gust of wind sent a flurry of snow into their faces, their voices carrying through the frosty air. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. This scene, so simple, so ordinary, was everything she'd hoped for. The house no longer felt like an empty monument to wealth. It felt alive, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future where they all belonged. As the months passed, Jack began to thrive not just at home but also in school. Clara made sure he had everything he needed: new clothes, school supplies, and plenty of encouragement. She met with his teachers regularly, keeping tabs on his progress and celebrating each small victory. Harrison surprised her by attending one of Jack's school events, sitting in the front row and beaming with pride as Jack presented a project to his class. Jack's smile that day was brighter than Clara had ever seen. But it wasn't just Jack who had changed. Clara, too, found herself rediscovering parts of herself that had long been buried under the weight of family expectations. She took on new projects at the shelter, expanding its reach and creating programs to help other children like Jack. Her work felt meaningful in a way it never had before, and she knew it was because she now understood, deeply and personally, what it meant to fight for someone's future. One crisp afternoon in March, Clara and Jack walked through the woods behind the estate, the bare branches above them beginning to bud with the first hints of spring. Jack had grown taller over the winter, his steps more confident as he navigated the winding trails. He held Clara's hand loosely, a gesture that was less about seeking reassurance and more about the comfort of being close. "Do you think Mom would be happy?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Clara stopped, kneeling beside him so they were eye level. "I think she'd be incredibly proud of you," she said. "You're brave, kind, and smart. She'd be so happy to see the amazing boy you're growing into." Jack's brow furrowed, his gaze distant. "I miss her," he admitted, "but it doesn't hurt as much now. Being here, it makes it better." Clara reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I'm glad, Jack. I'm so glad you feel that way. And it's okay to miss her. She'll always be a part of you." Jack nodded, his small hand tightening around hers. They stayed like that for a moment, the quiet of the woods wrapping around them like a blanket. Then Jack smiled, his eyes bright with a determination that reminded Clara of his resilience. "Let's keep walking," he said. As spring blossomed into summer, the Winslow family found their footing in their new normal. Harrison continued to grow into his role as Jack's father, balancing his work commitments with his responsibilities at home. Clara marveled at the way her father had embraced this second chance, his once guarded heart now open in ways she'd never thought possible. One evening in late June, the three of them sat on the back porch, the scent of freshly cut grass filling the air. Jack was busy building a small fort out of sticks and rocks in the yard, his laughter ringing out as he worked. Clara and Harrison sat side by side, watching him with matching smiles. "Thank you, Clara," Harrison said suddenly, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. She turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," he said. "For bringing Jack into my life. For showing me what really matters." Clara's heart swelled at his words. "You didn't need me to show you, Dad. It was always there. You just had to let yourself see it." Harrison nodded, his gaze soft as he looked at Jack. "He's changed everything," he said. "I didn't know how much I needed this. How much I needed him." Clara rested her hand on her father's, her voice firm. "We all needed him, and he needed us. That's what family is." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Clara felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. This journey, filled with heartache, challenges, and moments of doubt, had led them here, to a place of healing and love. Jack ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Look," he exclaimed, holding up a perfectly balanced stack of stones. "It's my fort." "It's amazing," Clara said, pulling him into a hug. "You're amazing." Jack beamed, leaning into her embrace. Harrison reached over, ruffling Jack's hair with a grin. "You've got an engineer's mind, kid. Maybe one day you'll build something even bigger." Jack laughed, his eyes sparkling. "Maybe I will." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the three of them sat together on the porch, the warmth of their bond wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. They were a family, imperfect, but perfect in their love for one another. And in that moment, Clara knew that no matter what challenges the future might hold, they would face them together. because that was what family did.